Welcome to Come Follow Me in week 9, which is 2nd Nephi chapters 11 through to 19. And here we continue the idea of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon in a great deal, but chapter 11 gives us some insight into why Nephi is using Isaiah, or why Joseph thinks it's so important. And really we see a really prevalent 19th century Protestant understanding that Jesus was involved in the Old Testament, and Isaiah particularly is talking about him a lot. And we see this really prominent idea that God's prophets see Jesus. And this is reiterated with Jacob, and it's reiterated with Nephi and other prophets throughout the Book of Mormon. And Joseph himself seems to see a need to have a Jesus experience, which becomes the 1832 first vision account. And we also have this understanding of modern prophets and apostles seeing Jesus, that it's a very common thing. Yet, actually, we know from quotes that this does not happen. And it's this understanding that seeing Jesus, or seeing him in the text of Isaiah, is proving Jesus and having an understanding of Christ and his coming. That from the very beginning of the world, everything is pointing towards Christ, and that everything after Christ is pointing back to him. That he is the central, the meridian, the important piece in this puzzle. And Nephi is using this word prove throughout chapter 11 to really emphasize the idea that Christ needs to be proved in the Old Testament through Isaiah and also in our day. And the understanding that if there is no Christ, there is no creation, there is nothing, that everything is pivotal on Christ. And there's that idea, again, that Trinitarian modalism idea that God is Christ, Christ is God, that this is the embodiment of God in the flesh. Now the next 13 chapters, beginning at Isaiah chapter 2 into 2nd Nephi chapter 12, are just straight Isaiah chapters quoted word for word out of the King James Bible, with those minor changes that we talked about before. And what's fascinating about these next 13 chapters of Isaiah is that there's going to be no commentary, no explanation, no real reason why they are there. And in fact, they don't even appear in the original manuscript. They only appear in the printer's version. Which also means they could have been added later, that they weren't actually done in this dictation sequence, and that they were there to kind of pad out 2nd Nephi because it didn't seem to have a lot of weight without it. Have you ever considered that the Book of Mormon actually ends at the Book of Mormon, with Mormon passing off the record to his son Moroni and dying, and Moroni not knowing where to go, and finishing the book on Mormon chapter 9. So here's Mormon chapter 8, where Moroni is telling about the death of his father, Mormon, and the idea that he's going to finish the record, and this is it done. And he can't write anymore because there is no more ore, and so there's nothing with which he can add to the record with. And he's alone, he's by himself, he can't get more ore, and so this is it. This is when the Book of Mormon finishes. He gives his last testimony in Mormon chapter 9, and that's it. The Book of Mormon is finished. Now there's no explanation, but the Book of Mormon doesn't finish there. It goes on with Ether, and then Moroni adds some more, finding some other writings of his father Mormon to include in Moroni before the Book of Mormon is finished. Now the reason this changes is because Joseph and Oliver and Emma are now at the Whitmer farm, and the scope of the Book of Mormon is changing. It's becoming much more religious. It's heading towards a church, and so there need to be witnesses because there needs to be proof. And 2nd Nephi chapter 11 talks about this proof in a number of ways, including having 3 people be witnesses. Verse 3 talks about these 3 witnesses and also other witnesses, which is going to be the 8 witnesses. This understanding of 3 witnesses comes up in Ether chapter 5, so in this text that's being written at the Whitmer farm, and I think is part of the replacement text, and also talking about how these witnesses are going to establish testimony. Because at the same time, in June of 1829, Joseph gets a revelation to the witnesses, which are now being identified as Martin Harris, David Whitmer, and Oliver Cowdery, and telling them their responsibility for being a witness. And this wording matches what is in ether, but it also has all of these incredible promises to the witnesses, but also almost veiled threats that they have to do this because otherwise this project is doomed. These three testifying to the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon is a commandment from Jesus Christ. And if they're willing to do this, the gates of hell will not prevail against them. So they're going to be lifted up at the last day. Doctrine and Covenants section 17 also talk about how they're going to see it just the way that Joseph sees it, through the eye of faith. And so it's really important that they testify it's true so that other people will be persuaded by it. Now this seems a little odd because Oliver and David and Martin are all heavily involved in this project and they want it to succeed. But the idea that God needs to compel them, that needs to emphasize how important it is for them to witness and to give them extreme reasons to do so, seems a little bit much considering what they're asked to do, considering their position already in the plan. And this all seems very extreme because David and Martin and Oliver haven't seen the plates up until this point, even though they've been scribes. But they've all really wanted to see the plates. They want to testify of its physical reality. And yet Joseph is getting this revelation that they have to testify, that they have to see it the way that Joseph sees it, and that they are going to be heavily rewarded if they testify that the gold plates are true, which suggests that what Joseph is going to show them, or what they're going to see in their mind's eye, is not exactly what it is that we think that they see. And these mentions in Ether and then in 2 Nephi chapter 11 and also in 2 Nephi chapter 27, talking about the three witnesses, puts them into the scriptures, makes them part of this incredible large plan of God, which also binds them with this duty to testify to it. This seems manipulative and coercive rather than a free will offering. The remainder of the chapters in this week's Come Follow Me are all just copies of Isaiah chapters, and this runs up through to chapter 24, which is Isaiah chapter 14. And so Isaiah 2 through to 14 are preserved in this part of the Book of Mormon. This is quite odd. The idea that we have these multiple chapters of just straight Isaiah being copied out of the King James Version of the Bible is very odd. It's anachronistic for its time frame, and of course, as we've already talked about, it's not used by biblical scholars to give us any idea of a greater or an earlier account of Isaiah. So it's got no practical use whatsoever. But it does have quite a use to Joseph, and that is that it gives him a bit of padding because he needs to give some weight to this replacement text, because what has been lost really needs to be kind of replaced. And there is an idea that this may have been done after the dictation sequence and been added back in later in the printer's manuscript. And researcher Chris Allen has talked about this a little bit. So there's some really interesting things to know, and you can look at these on the Joseph Smith's Papers Project. And if you compare the original manuscript and the printer's manuscript, you can find some discrepancies. One of the great oddities is that there was no original 2nd Nephi. It was just Nephi being carried on into chapters. And in the original manuscript, and you can see in this one, you might not be able to see it very well, you might have to go onto the Joseph Smith's Papers Project to look at it in depth, but you can see that Oliver wrote chapter 8 for this part that is the beginning of 2nd Nephi, and then later it was changed to 2nd Nephi chapter 1. Now, the original manuscript has a big gap at this point, which suggests that there's a lot of missing text, and this text could have been inserted later in the dictation process with the production of the printer's manuscript from August and later. The evidence that gives weight to this is that in the printer's manuscript, Oliver copied down the information and wording, but he left out the chapter numbers. He just left them blank to be inserted later. This is really problematic with regard to 2nd Nephi, because these chapters should be already there, and yet Oliver doesn't know what the chapter numbers are. These inserted chapter numbers suggest that there might have been information added later in the printer's manuscript part of the production of the Book of Mormon to pad this part of the replacement text. And this could also apply to other parts of the replacement text, including Omni and Words of Mormon, which seem very odd in the sequence, and we'll talk about them sometime later. This information could completely change the way that we understand the dictation sequence and the way that Joseph allowed for the replacement text in the Book of Mormon. And it could explain why there is so much Isaiah in this part of 2nd Nephi, because it was added later rather than done just at the time. While we've got a bit of time in this week, let's talk about the original manuscript and how it affects our understanding of the Book of Mormon. So the Joseph Smith Papers Project allows you to look at facsimile copies of the original manuscript in high detail so you can drill down on them, and also have a transcript of what it looks like and what text is still existent. And so it's well worthwhile going and checking out. The Joseph Smith Papers also provide a source note and a historical note to be able to give a greater understanding of what all happened and how it happened and with whom it happened. And so these are some of the things we're going to go over today, but it's worth reading them in their entirety. The dictation of the Book of Mormon started around the 12th of April, 1828, and lasted for a couple of months. And the scribes at this particular time were Emma Smith, Joseph's wife, Reuben Hale, Emma's brother, and of course Martin Harris, who did the bulk of it through to June. Harris then took the majority, if not all, of the manuscript back to Palmyra to convince his wife of the authenticity of this work, and during that time these were completely lost and never recovered. The Book of Mormon dictation wasn't picked up again until early the next year, probably March of 1829, and we know that Emma Smith did some scribing and that also Samuel Smith did some scribing before Oliver Cowdery came in on the 5th of April and began scribing on the 7th of April 1829. It's interesting to note that actually Martin Harris came to Harmony in March of 1829, and Dan Vogel suggests that he might have done a little bit of scribing. In fact, Mosiah chapter 4, that was related to him in that particular moment. But because we don't have this part of the original manuscript, we can't tell who the scribes were and when. In June of 1829, Joseph and Oliver and Emma relocated to the Whitmer farm in Fayette, New York. And there we know that there are some other scribes, particularly John Whitmer, who is in the text of the replacement portion of the Book of Mormon, that first bit. And there is an unknown scribe that we believe is Christian Whitmer. And what's really interesting about this is it confirms the idea that the first bit of the Book of Mormon, Nephi through to Omni, was done later at the very end of the dictation process in Fayette, New York. And this is something that Brent Metcalf talked about in 1993 with his study of the Book of Mormon, and which got him excommunicated. And yet this is what we know from the original manuscript. The Book of Mormon was then finished at the end of June and into July, and a printer's manuscript was created to then work on the printing of the Book of Mormon. The original manuscript was kept by Joseph Smith, and he put it into the cornerstone of the Nauvoo house on the 2nd of October 1841. The original manuscript stayed in this cornerstone until 1882, when Emma's second husband, Louis Bederman, unearthed the cornerstone and recovered the pages, but because of water leakage and damage, a lot of it was completely unusable. Various portions of this original manuscript exist, and we have about 28% of it intact and that we can actually look at. So that means there's huge gaps everywhere, and so there's a few things that we just can't know for certain because we can't see the original transcript. But what is existent has been photographed and transcribed, and you can read it on the Joseph Smith Papers Project. Let's talk about the printer's manuscript for a minute, because when the Book of Mormon was organized for publication, Joseph and Oliver organized for a second copy because they were worried with the loss of the 116 pages that the Book of Mormon could be under threat, and so they prepared a copy called the printer's manuscript that was going to be used to take to the printer and back, so that there would always be an original and so that there would be a copy if anything happened. This was primarily done by Oliver Cowdery. In fact, 84% of it is in his handwriting. And then there's an unknown scribe, which has 14%, and then 1%, which was Hiram Smith. So he actually got some scribing in there too. And you can see from these pages behind me that they were all handwritten, and they're run-on sentences, so there's no punctuation whatsoever. And in fact, punctuation was done by the printer to be able to make this possible to be able to read. Copying the original into a printer's manuscript was done alongside the publication as it was going along, and so it went right through to perhaps February of 1830. And pretty much the entirety of the Book of Mormon that we have today can be sourced in the printer's manuscript, and you can read it online as it was. And you can see from the colour, it is brown as opposed to the white of the original manuscript. It's been kept in quite good condition. It was taken and used by Joseph and his associates during the 1830s, and then utilised for the reprinting of the Book of Mormon in 1837, and then retained by Oliver Cowdery, and he passed it on to David Whitmer, whose son then passed it and was able to effectively sell it to the reorganised Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the earliest 20th century. And then it was bought by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints much later in the piece, and is now housed by them. During the 20th and 21st centuries, photocopies were done of the printer's manuscript, and also facsimile copies, and these are high quality grade, now available on the Joseph Smith Papers Project website. There is a large section of the printer's manuscript which doesn't have any punctuation, and that is because it was utilised to go and sell the copyright in Canada, according to Joseph's revelation, and because that failed, it was just brought back. But in this case, the original manuscript was then used for the printing of roughly Helaman 13 right through to the end of the Book of Mormon. Because the manuscript of the Book of Mormon doesn't have any punctuation, a lot of that has been added later, and spelling and grammar corrected, so that we have a much more polished version of it now than this, even the 1830 version was. And we can also see in the printed manuscript some changes that were made by Joseph in the 1837 version to bring it up to date with the theology that was then happening in Ohio. But the vast majority of the printer's manuscript is how it appeared in 1830 and how it still appears now with the 2013 edition.